for this invitation. I just want to start by saying, look, this event marks another sort of milestone that the people of Manipur have achieved. You've got one of the smallest populations of this country who are fighting one of the biggest battles in the Supreme Court of India to say how should the state deal with conflicts and respect for human rights and the law. And the fact that they've reached the stage that they have is a remarkable victory within itself. And we can say that because Punjab was there 20 or 25 years ago, starting its struggle for justice and accountability. And just following on from that, we can look at things in different perspectives, you know, whether we're losing a battle, whether we're succeeding in the struggle for human rights. But one of the biggest victories that I've seen as recently as yesterday in the order that was passed by the outgoing now chair of the Supreme Court bench is that they've pierced a very important veil, and that is, for the first time, they've taken on the narrative that somehow if you call to account the actions of the security forces and the police, that you're either anti-national, that it's going to demoralize anti-terror operations in the country, and it will undermine how the system of policing and governance takes place in this country. They have succeeded, in my view, in a very sort of big aspect to the overall struggle. An important victory has been won. And it'll be interesting to see how that whole thing unfolds. The people of Punjab are watching the developments of Manipur very, very closely because the work that we've been involved in sort of rewinds back to the period of the 80s and 90s, and many of the sort of younger generation of the population haven't seen or sort of really read much on what happened in Punjab during the period of sort of 1984 to 1995. And I think that the main thing that comes out in the narrative, and even this has only been in the last sort of, I would say, 7 or 8 years, is what happened in Delhi with the anti-Sikh massacres. And, you know, there seems to be this collective now turning of a corner that, look, what happened was really bad. It shouldn't have happened to the Sikhs. They shouldn't have been butchered and massacred in that way. But it actually completely ignores what was taking place in the villages of Punjab over a 10-year period, where there was a brutal and relentless counterinsurgency campaign, which started actually before 1984 and culminated in 1995 with the abduction, murder, and disappearance of a human rights activist called Jaswant Singh Kalra, who had exposed 3 cremation grounds in one district of Amritsar, where 2,097 people had been cremated by the Punjab police as unclaimed and unidentified. So the context in which I want to bring this, and it really has to be tied into Manipur, and I think one thing none of us should really lose sight on, is today is about what are the potential solutions and the discussion about transitional justice frameworks for Manipur. And I'm going to make some observations whether transitional justice is really the correct place for the Manipur issue to be right now. But just to give you sort of some background into what happened in Punjab. Now, as I explained, this case of 2,097 cremations was exposed by this activist. He filed a writ petition in the Punjab and Haryana High Court in 1995 to say, we've got evidence to show that the Punjab police knew the identities of these people. They were killed in cold blood. And there's an audit, everything from the FIR to the post-mortems, which disclose the names. But lo and behold, within 3 hours of a post-mortem being done, which has the person's name, caste, village, father's name, he becomes an unclaimed, unidentified person in a cremation ground. The Punjab and Haryana High Court dismissed Kalra's petition and said it was vague and unsubstantiated. And in fact, Kalra very bravely took the steps of naming particular police officers and saying that these officers were involved, and these officers were in very high positions of power. In fact, the DGP of Punjab Police at the time was Mr. KPS Gill, who's renowned as the sort of hero super cop of India, the cool guy who's now passed away, that in these sorts of insurgency operations, He's brought peace to Punjab, and he was heralded as, you know, the bringer of peace and tranquility to the state. Kalra openly challenged the police, and the police openly challenged him back. And he gave an estimate that there were 25,000 people that had been either extrajudicially killed, disappeared, or killed and secretly cremated by the Punjab police. And the Punjab police's response to him, very openly in the public media, was, you've got your statistics wrong. It's actually 25,001. And that was a very sort of direct, explicit threat to him that the work that he was doing would result in his own, you know, disappearance. And that's ultimately what happened. Kalra was picked up. His wife filed a telegram to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court took that as a suo motu writ. And what happened, I'm going to very briefly, you know, sort of outline to you. And the reason I'm going into a bit of detail is because this is where the Manipuris are now with their sort of litigation struggle and the struggle for justice and accountability. It took his disappearance for the Supreme Court to order an inquiry into his disappearance. And then, prior to his abduction, there had been an appeal filed from the Punjab and Haryana High Court into his findings. So the Supreme Court took cognizance of both issues. They ordered the CBI to conduct a high-powered inquiry into Kalra's disappearance and also these 2,097 unclaimed, unidentified cremations. It took 17 years to convict a number of officers. The CBI filed a charge sheet. KPS Gill was named as one of the officers who had ordered his abduction and was involved in the interrogation. He was never charge sheeted. And interestingly, if you look at, in a similar way that the professor has very eloquently highlighted the flaws of Wikipedia, if you Google KPS Gill, Narendra Modi had asked for his services post-2002 Gujarat massacres, because we all know the Sohrabuddin and fake encounters that took place there. And if you look at this man's tour of duty, he was appointed special advisor in Chhattisgarh, where human rights violations had taken a peak under the guise of these anti-Naxal operations. And then his career became an international career, because then he was deputed by the Sri Lankan government to give his perspective on the Tamil conflict. And we know ultimately how that conflict ended. He was given very prominent positions. He was the head of a think tank on counterinsurgency, and the doctrine that was named after his legacy was called the Gill Doctrine, and it's written in very eloquent terms. There's the South Asian Terrorism Portal, which he wrote prolifically for. And the narrative has been that, look, we successfully brought peace to the country and peace to Punjab. And what had happened is the whole Kalra narrative after his death had completely taken a sort of byline. And the groups in Punjab fought a very vociferous campaign to get this case some justice, this 2097. The Supreme Court delegated the responsibility to the National Human Rights Commission to look into all of these cases, and they asked the CBI to furnish secret reports, sealed cover reports on the progress of these investigations. The NHRC decided that it wasn't going to look at any cremations outside of Amritsar. So the first sort of fatal blow to justice in Punjab was that these were 3 cremation grounds in one district, and there are 27 districts in Punjab. So if there were 2,000 cremations just there, and there was mirror patterns that were happening everywhere else, within one fell blow that was just chopped off. Then secondly, there was a process of very clever legal contortion, that where the groups were very vociferously arguing, and in fact the lawyers, namely Colin Gonsalves, Indra Jai Singh, Nitya Ramakrishna, some really big, heavyweight, prominent human rights lawyers in Delhi, argued this case very eloquently to say that there should have been a wider inquiry in Punjab. So when we're talking about this sort of model of justice and how you sort of prevent these things happening in future, the Punjab episode has to be looked at very carefully. And then ultimately what happened was that the NHRC decided two things. One is they said, despite the Supreme Court saying, we're giving you sui generis powers of the Supreme Court, so the NHRC wasn't regarded as a recommendatory body. The order said, you're given the entire power of the Supreme Court to do justice in this case. The NHRC then had to decide, what do you do with these 2,097 cases? It took until 2012 to identify 1,517 of those unclaimed, unidentified cremations. When this case went before the Supreme Court, the narrative that the people of Manipur are presently sort of going through was exactly what happened in Punjab. The Punjab police said, we were fighting a war against terrorism for the nation, and now you're looking at us as common criminals. And KPS Gill said some significant things which have now been debunked over the period of time. One thing he said is this is war by litigation on the armed forces. That they're trying to overawe us, and the human rights activists were seen, he said that these are the overground faces of the underground movement. So immediately, these people were sort of stigmatized. But the tragedy wasn't that this was just coming from the usual quarters. Tavleen Singh, who's a very prominent journalist, in fact a Sikh journalist herself, covered a particular story. KPS Gill's next most senior subordinate, a person called Ajit Singh Sandhu, was indicted for Kalara's abduction. And once the charge sheet had been filed, he had actually been remanded into custody. In very sort of mysterious circumstances, he committed suicide. Gill wrote a letter to the then Prime Minister to say, these people have fought so bravely for the country and you're treating them like common criminals. And Tavleen Singh wrote this article, how the human rights wallahs led to Ajit Singh Sandhu's death. Now, I can go into lots of chapters and things about, particular characters. During our documentation work, Ajit Singh Sandhu's name is mentioned in no less than 120 cases. He died before he was convicted, but his role in the Kalara murder was upheld by the trial court, the High Court, and by the Supreme Court of India, who made some very strong observations about how there's a nexus and this complete cloak when you're trying to prove a custodial death and a disappearance and abduction of a person, how there's a sort of pooling of ranks and joining of things. There's never been, the media had a very important role to play, but the media sort of followed this line that was being given by, the army and the police personnel. So these things, the CBI prosecution was never disclosed. So the lawyers argued repeatedly, how many cases are being investigated of these unclaimed, unidentified cremations? And the answer to that was that we're submitting reports to the Supreme Court in sealed covers, and we don't want to prejudice the investigations. There's a whole book written on this whole saga about how many cases were being, but the long and short of it was that nobody ever knew, even though the Supreme Court was monitoring this. No one knew, no one had any input into the CBI investigation or the trials, or what was happening, whether it was 100 or 50 or whatever, 200, 1,500, whatever it was. The other thing that was coming out when the police were taking a public defense of this is they were saying, well, people disappear every day in India. It's a country of 1.2 billion. And a lot of these disappearances, it's all propaganda. There are Bihari migrants that work in Punjab, rickshawalas that die every day. And these numbers are concocted. Maybe some of these are militants who've now settled abroad. And these are the sort of contemporary narratives. By 2012, the NHRC had granted compensation to 1,512 people. We started doing documentation in the Punjab from about 2007. One of the first things we did is we carried out a 6-month inspection at the NHRC of families that had submitted claim forms, because this was the most cogent piece of evidence. The state had invited claims for compensation, and they had furnished what had happened to their loved ones and what should have taken place and whether they were entitled to compensation. I'm going to come on to the compensation in a moment. In all of the narratives, the stories are the same. The police came at 4 o'clock in the morning. My son was picked up. He was taken to the police station. There was frantic efforts by the panchayat, the sarpanch of the village, and the families to find out. The police would say, don't worry, we're going to release him. And within about 4 or 5 days, they would read in the newspaper that a militant had been gunned down in an encounter who'd been firing on the police. It was a copy-paste story that had been taking place in Punjab. Now, we did an audit, and what the Punjab police had said in each and every one of these cases is these were encounters. They'd copy and pasted the encounter FIR, effectively. In a single case, not in a single case, did the Punjab police say that this was a fictitious claim, it should be rejected. And not in a single case had they said, well, the identity of this person can't be ascertained, or that this person was a migrant laborer, or this person was a civilian that had nothing to do with the conflict in Punjab. Not a single case. Not in a single inquiry did they say that one of the victims was abroad and had settled elsewhere. So the narrative was compelling, conclusive evidence of 1,517 cases where you've acknowledged compensation. Now, confronted with such a huge number, what did the NHRC do? So the arguments, in the same way we're having, should this be an inquiry against the higher sections of the Punjab police, command structure, command responsibility, international principles? Is it just a few bad apples that were operating? Was it more systematic? Should the governor, should the Punjab government, should the central government? All of these things were being ventilated. And again, I'm not going to sort of, because time is pressing, but the NHRC came to this formula. Yes, this has been a gross violation of human rights. And the rights relate to the dignity of the dead. And the dignity of the dead is this, that at the time of the cremation, the Punjab police should have contacted the family, and the family should have been present during the cremation. So according to the Punjab police rules, you're supposed to identify the body and hand it over to the family. That was the human rights violation, the dignity of the dead body. And it's the most bizarre, ridiculous, contorted way of dealing with a mass state crime to try and give some compensation. Not how did the person die, why was he in the custody of the Punjab police, and explain these bullet injuries to the forehead or the back of the head and marks to the wrists and all that, but to give them some justice. And in fact, the order from the NHRC by a very sort of prominent former Supreme Court Chief Justice said, let this be a balm to the wounds. When we spoke to the family, we asked them, you know, how do you regard this? They said, this isn't putting balm on the wound, this is putting salt and aggravating an injury that we had. So the biggest injustice for Punjab was there wasn't any big truth commission. The NHRC completely buried the cases by just focusing on unclaimed, unidentified cremation, body not being given back to the family. The CBI cases remained a complete mystery until 2016. No one knew. RTIs had been filed before we started our work, and then we filed an RTI to say how many cases, and then the CBI said, look, this is official information, we can't disclose it. In 2016, we discovered that the Punjab police officers who were facing prosecution had argued successfully that because Punjab was operating under the Punjab Disturbed Areas Act, you needed sanction from the central government. And in a number of these CBI cases, sanction was obtained, but the police officers had said that you can't put the sanction on us, that legally the procedure hadn't been followed. They appealed to the district court, then to the High Court. The case got delayed for 5 years. It took 11 years for the Supreme Court to determine in an order in 2016 that sanction wasn't required, where the CBI had filed a prima facie charge sheet of a fake encounter. Then we discovered that there were 44 cases in this order. So the next phase of our work was, well, very helpfully, the High Court has now narrated the cases. So we contacted the families, and we became their lawyers. And we said that we have a right now to represent the complainants in this case. We're entitled to the charge sheets and the evidence. And then from 2016 onwards, we unraveled that there were 44 cases from 1,517 where the bodies had been identified. And the reason I say that this is particularly relevant for the Manipur scenario is because the groups have documented 1,600 cases. Now, we now know that there's only a handful of charge sheets that have been filed, and the big scandal here is there should be but can we see the same patterns emerging? In fact, during the course of the NHRC proceedings, again, there's a catch-22 situation, because the victim and the human rights organizations that were trying to identify the dead bodies needed the FIRs. And the police were reluctant to give the FIRs because they said, well, the real reason was because then you could see which officers were doing the killings. So again, a very clever formula came about. So we're talking about 2,000 FIRs just from Amritsar, where the Punjab police position was that if you put these names in the public domain, the terrorists will kill the Punjab police officers, even though there hasn't been any insurgency-related killing post-95, and there hasn't been, any targeting of police officers because his name was disclosed. So there was a mass effort put into redacting and blacking out the names of all the Punjab police officers, and then they said, well, you only need the information to identify victims. So 2,097 FIRs with names blacked out, CBI special reports in sealed covers, not a single name disclosed of what is the status of a single prosecution, and it took us till 2016 to accidentally discover in a group order, because all the cases had been clubbed together, there were 44. Now, these struggles for justice are very long and very hard, and there's been many, many lawyers that have come before, and no doubt that will come after us. And the one thing that I want to really make clear is that if the lessons are not learned from Punjab, you will be dealing with CBI cases in 2050. 1984, there were 16 commissions of inquiry. The last SIT just on those killings was set up in 2016. And not a single SIT or commission of inquiry has asked the question, why did the other 11 or 12 SITs fail? And why is it that these issues are used as a political football, dole out, as one of the speakers mentioned, 5 lakh compensation, and it will make them go away? Congress will use these killings of Gujarat against the BJP. BJP will mention this, finger point to the Congress. So actually, if we're looking at these things, we're not looking in isolation. Every major political party, Congress, BJP, Akali Dal, and others, have blood on their hands. And if we were to actually strip away and look at command structures, and whether in 1992, when the centre announced Operation Rakshak, which was a clean-up operation in Punjab, that's documented. The Prime Minister, the Chief Minister of Punjab, said that we need to bring normalcy back to Punjab. There was an operation. So how far do you go back? So when these lower-level subordinate officers are convicted, and they say, we did this, because the discussions that are probably happening behind closed doors in Manipur and other places is, well, hold on a second. If we are convicted, we're going to point the finger at you. In 2002, a group of Punjab police officers, when the charge sheets were filed, said, if you put us on trial, we will name which officers told us to do this. If those officers come into the dock, they will say, well, look, this wasn't a police decision. The army and the police don't go in because they are there for the sake of it. I mean, come on, let's be real about, there's a command structure. So then who would they point the finger to? And then where does the buck stop? Amit Shah, who's facing trial in a fake encounter case? Sajjan Kumar and Jagdish Taitler, whose names are mentioned in the Sikh genocidal massacres, who were given tickets? Kamal Nath, who's now the face of the Congress campaign in Madhya Pradesh. Where does the buck stop? And when... Thank you. As Ravi knows, because he's done a lot of work in the Punjab. So when we're looking at this in the abstract from an academic point of view, one thing we have to understand is the nature of the beast. That you can have some kind of inquiry, but if you wanted to sort of really say, how do we chip away at the system and make sure that this doesn't repeat, there are electoral gains for killings in the northeast. There are electoral gains when genocidal massacres happen. Sajjan Kumar won by a landslide in 1984. The Congress were returned to power because there was a wave of anti-Sikh sentiment. The Gujarat riots have elevated someone from a chief minister to the Prime Minister of this country. I'm not making a political point now, because I'm saying look at the whole system here. And when Professor Shiv made the point that this country was born in genocide, we don't even call it a genocide. So the thing that I really want to sort of bring to the fore is there are three really important things as far as I can see. We can have the debate about the structures. Number one is you can either have two systems as far as I can see. This is as black and white as this. Either, like some African countries, you say that some crimes are so heinous, genocide, crimes against humanity, these sorts of things, you have to submit to a wider jurisdiction, like the International Criminal Court. And it's not just because you want to prosecute these kinds of people and you want them to go to international forums. This is the break. This means you can't get away with it, because if you do, and this is what the Palestinians are trying to do, because they're such a helpless and hapless, group of people that they don't have any other recourse, or other small minority groups. That this is the gold standard. It may be imperfect. I'm not saying it's the best, but this is the gold standard. The alternative to that is your domestic laws have to criminalize genocide, have to criminalize crimes against humanity, targeted killings, torture, enforced disappearances. We haven't even got a law in this country that criminalizes torture. Those are the two options. The third option is we just don't do anything. We called the genocidal pogroms of 1984 riots. They're not riots because they weren't two communities fighting against each other. It was an onslaught where the administration allowed this thing to happen. And just to bring it into context, while Indira Gandhi's funeral was happening, where you had Fidel Castro, the State Departments, dignitaries, prime ministers, foreign secretaries, everyone gathering for Indira Gandhi's funeral, and the streets of Delhi were burning with Sikh massacres. I mean, what a paradox. We're not talking about the border areas. We're not talking about Manipur and Assam and, things are lawless. We're talking about, that has never been looked at. And if you listen to any of the debates, it's an election issue. It's not an issue for civil society. So coming back to the point is, we are in a situation where we have no protections. If there's a Muzaffarnagar type scenario as there was before 2012, if there's something happening in Kashmir, if there's lynchings, so-called lynchings, because somebody is supposedly carrying beef when he was actually going about his business and whatever nonsense is happening, and then the debate is, should we have a communal violence bill or should we have an anti-lynching bill? No, there needs to, these are heinous crimes. These are crimes where if they're done with the patronage of the state, you would be held accountable in all sorts of forums. And we don't have any protection. The people of India do not have any protection. So the debate is, Manipur is best placed to sort of answer this in the Supreme Court now, that we don't have any protection. And then if they decide to set up an SIT in the Supreme Court in the Manipur case, and then they decide, well, actually, we're only going to look at 50, 100, in 2 or 3 years' time, I can guarantee the debates that we'll be having in the forums in Delhi will be Bablu and Ivam saying, well, they only filed 20 charge sheets, but we gave them 1,500. And in those 20 charge sheets, they've delayed it 5 years in the High Court now by arguing sanction. And then it took another 10 years. And his hair will be white, and these young widows will be grandmothers like they are in Punjab. And this is the screaming tragedy of this country, that you don't have to look far for examples. Now, I can talk to you about the work that we've done in documentation. I'll deal with that briefly. Is that we started... Yeah. Sure. Just one line. The importance of documentation is verifiable evidence and data has to be collected. And in the villages of Punjab, people have long memories. You go to a village, and if you ask the elders sitting under a tree, can you tell us how many people were killed by the Punjab police? They'll tell you, take them to the house. Even people that have rivalries with each other will ask you, why are you doing this? And we're trying to get some compensation for the families. They'll narrate those stories, as Professor Shiv was saying. So we started a documentation project, and it was deliberately focused on the area just outside of Amritsar to show the Supreme Court and the NHRC that there were 600 cases just from one small district. The documentation has continued. We've collected a number of different sources, and what we're hoping to do is to knock back on the door of the Supreme Court to say that there isn't any time limit on this, and you've taken the initiative in the Manipur case. You've done it. You set up an SIT in Gujarat, fake encounter cases. We're not saying it's perfect, but you've already set a precedent that something has to be done. So that the narrative now has to be, ultimately, the buck has to stop with the state, and laws need to be enacted that bring things to international standards. And in the intervening, this transitional period, we have to keep pressing that having a handful of steps taken and the narrative of this somehow, diminishes the state. It shouldn't be there. And just, I'm sorry for taking up time. Just the very last thing that I'd like to end this on is one thing India prides itself on is when it's compared to Pakistan, the narrative in India is the Pakistan military runs the country, and they've never really got over this hang-up of military dictatorships and the military and the ISI running the country. Now, why is it that you're ceding even an inch to allow the military to say, or the armed forces, or the police to say, we've got such a blanket immunity in this country, we don't even have to be answerable to the Supreme Court of India. And when you get to that debate, that's where the line has to be drawn, that for a very important reason, there's a demarcation between keeping every institution in check and having the checks and balances. So my plea would be that there needs to be a lot more debate out there to say that this isn't about Arnab Goswami's debates about the army somehow being overawed and this, that, and the other. It's actually saying that you want an effective, better policing of this country where you don't allow criminal elements to do this for whatever reason. Thank you.